Hi and welcome to Will Henry's workshop, where I am getting closer to coming to the end of the lineup of Kimber rifles that I've been rebarreling. In the lathe this morning is the barrel for the 338-06. I've contoured it to slightly larger dimensions than the factory barrel, larger at the muzzle, and I've set it up in the lathe as usual in the headstock. It's dialed in at both ends, and then I roughed the chamber out. I drilled it with a common twist drill to a depth of about 1.5 inches, and then I go in after with a boring bar with the compound set at a taper of 0.04 of an inch per inch, which is roughly what the 338-06 is. And that way I have a nice straight start for the reamer, and everything should go swimmingly. Just a little bit about the 338-06 for those not familiar. It is simply the 30-06 neck down up to 338, and uses the same bullets as the 338 Winchester would, and it's quite a good cartridge. Now, it's not a 338 Magnum, and a person shouldn't try to make it be one, but it is a very good cartridge. About 40 years ago, I built myself a rifle, a hunting rifle in 35 Whelen, which there again is an old Wildcat, which was legitimized by Remington, and I always kind of liked that cartridge, so I made myself a 35 Whelen, and if I had it to do over again, I might very well choose the 338-06. There's an abundance of bullets available in 338 caliber, whereas 35 calibers you're a little limited, and it seems like with the slightly smaller bore diameter, it's just enough to allow the use of a whole bunch of different powders that won't work in a 35 Whelen. And also the performance is a little better, and there again, simply because you can use powders that are a little bit slower, and like I say, they seem to achieve a little more. In the end, the 338-06, like the 35 Whelen, will push 250 grain bullets to about the 25-50 mark. 225s will do another 100 feet a second, and 200s will do in the mid-27s easily. Now, some people will push them harder than that, but I've always said if you want a 338 Magnum, build a 338 Magnum, and if you load the 338-06 to what it's easily capable of, you'll have a rifle that will work very well, and case life will be forever, and so on. But anyway, that's the 338-06, and that's what we're going to be chambering this barrel for. So prior to doing that, what I'm going to do is set the camera up in a different location, and we've gone through chambering jobs before, but hopefully this time I'll come up with some information that I've missed before, because Lord knows I always miss something. So you're going to be paused. Well, there we are. We've got the camera set up to where we've got a fairly good view, I think, and so we'll go ahead and get started. The reamer I'm using this time is a climber, and you'll see how it works for me. I've used it before, so it shouldn't have any surprises. Now for speed, I'm sure I've mentioned it before, but we'll be turning this at 90 RPM. As I know I've mentioned before, recommendations are to run a lot of these reamers a little faster, but I started out reaming at slower speeds, and I'm comfortable with it, so I've never seen fit to change. Start with a good dollop of oil. There we go. Now with the pre-boring, this first little bit, the reamer's cutting very little. I left about 2/1000ths of an inch on each side, bored on the taper, and so it'll be cutting very little until I hit the end of the board section, which is about a 1/2 inch long. And there we are. I've hit the end of that section, and I see I've got some chips showing now, so I'll pull out and clean. So far we're getting a really nice finish, so it's always good to see. Now this is a solid pilot reamer, and with the solid pilot I think they work just fine. But it's even more important to make sure that all the chips are clear, so that you don't mark the bore with a chip that gets caught on the pilot. I've heard some people recommend the use of a heavier oil like STP or something like that on a solid pilot. I don't subscribe to that theory, just because heavy oils like that might tend to hold chips more so than the unadulterated rigid oil that I'm using. Now we've gone in far enough that I believe the neck is starting to cut. And I see just a little scratch there in the chamber, so at this point I'll carefully feel here and see if I've picked up a chip anywhere. Feels all right, so we should be okay. And once again, clear the chips from the barrel. So as you can see, when it comes to reaming a chamber, it's really kind of a case of another day, another chamber, and everything's done about the same, regardless of the chamber and so on. For a match rifle, a person might take a little more pains to get everything straight, but no matter what the use, there's no reason not to try and make the straightest chamber that you can. And when I'm reaming like this, as is obvious, I kind of go for the I use this squirt the oil method rather than having a flow-through system. And anyway, I'll ream until the chips start coming out the back. And once you have a flute that's filling up with chips, it's time to pull out and clean the reamer and clean the chamber out and have a look. There again, just a little bit of a mark toward the rear, so check it out again. And there's just a little bit of a chip welded onto that surface. The rest of them are fine, but so I'll get my little stone. Just a little piece of triangular stone, and we'll just stone the faces, and in doing this you're really not changing anything, but if there are any little chips adhering to the cutting edge, you clean them off, and you can be sure you won't mark the chamber any further. This becomes even more important toward the end of the chamber as you're nearing the finish, because you really don't want to have a mark there. Now, a nice thing, and I've mentioned this before when I was reaming the Creedmoors, the 30-06 and cartridges of this era have a reasonable amount of body taper. They taper about 0.08 of an inch per inch, and that's enough taper so that if you do get a little mark, the reamer doesn't have to go in much further in order to clean it up. And so in that way, a case with a little more taper is a little nicer to work with as far as reaming is concerned. And we're almost there. Again, as you can see, the flutes are starting to fill, so it's time to pull out and check. Now, we're just about to the point where it's going to start cutting on the shoulder, and when it does that, I'll check the depth and see how much further I have to go, and then I'll probably go back in with the drill just to save some work for the reamer, and I'll probably, I think in this case, I'll be drilling in an extra 3/8 of an inch or so, and that's about it. Now I've already recorded my headspace measurement, which with this particular action requires that the distance from the barrel shoulder here to the face of the bolt is 0.860. So my gauge has to be 0.860 from this shoulder. Right now, as you can see, the gauge sticks out a ways. So it's going to end up, this length here is 0.890. So the gauge will end up 30 thousandths below the rear surface of the barrel, plus about 2 thousandths. I always allow 2 thousandths for crush when you tighten up, and you generally will use all of 2 thousandths of an inch. So I should end up with a chamber that has 0 headspace, which is, you don't want to make them any shorter, but everybody aims for 0, and if you have 1 or 2 thousandths of headspace, that's all right. But for a hunting rifle, you really don't want them too tight. But the rest of the thing proceeds just as it has been. There's no point in making you watch all of that, so I'm going to pause again. But in order to do that, I got to find the remote, and there we go. Look at that. What a memory. Okay, we'll see. Okay, here we are back again. Now, I've gone to the point where the shoulder started to cut in my pre-drilled hole. So now I'm going to drill about 7/16 of an inch further in. And this is just to save wear and tear on the reamer. And so I've sped it up a little bit, and give it a squirt of coolant here. Oh. And there we go, Bob's your uncle. That now I'll finish reaming it, and we'll be done with that part of the operation. Now, as I continue on here, I start pushing the reamer a lot less. That is, I feed more slowly, and I'm more careful about making sure there are no chips and so on, because the further we get, the better I want the finish to be between reamings. So now back to our chambering speed. important to remember to put the center back in the tailstock. Also, whereas early on I was reaming a quarter of an inch each time, now I reduce that to around 100,000ths of an inch. Again, just to try and eliminate any chance of making an ugly score in the chamber that I can't remove during the rest of the reaming operation. Now, since the rest of this is just tedium and I really have nothing interesting to say, I'm going to pause you again while I finish this up. Okay, now we're down to where we're about to make our final cut. The tenon here, I had said it was 0.890 long. It's actually 0.885. Since my headspace number is 860, that means that I want to be 25 thousandths below this rear surface, and right now I'm sitting right at 10. So I have to go 15, and then, as I've said before, I always like to allow 2 thousandths of an inch for crush. So I'll be going for 17 thousandths past this, or 27 thousandths deep. So to prepare for that, again, I'll take extra pains to make sure the reamer's clean before making that final cut. And in doing this, like I say, with the flow-through coolant lubrication system, a person can ream the whole chamber without checking. But I really think when you get down to the last few thousandths that you should pull out, check, and clean the reamer anyway. I've seen quite a few chambers that are cut, and this area right at the shoulder is rough inside the chamber, and that's because the reamer has picked up a little bit of metal on the cutting edge at that point, and so you don't get a nice smooth finish. And that shoulder should be just as smooth as the rest of the chamber. So now I've cleaned everything out, the reamer's clean, and I've got to cut 17 thousandths of an inch. So I'll set my tailstock to 0, and I engage the quill lock just a little bit to provide a little resistance, and that makes it a little easier for me anyway to feed smoothly for this last 17 thousandths. Now, as I know I've mentioned before, this final cut I feed very, very slowly. There again, in an effort to get the best finish I can. So there I'm at 13, 14, 15, 16, and 17 thousandths. And there we have it. Looks nice and shiny. And we'll see if I came anywhere close to my intended depth. Well, I was aiming for 27. I'm at about 26 and 4/5. So that's close enough for me. And so now the next step in this particular case is to cut the cone breech. We've done that before. There's nothing to tell you. I set the compound at 45 degrees. I'll cut the cone breech. I'll have a dial gauge set up that the carriage comes up against, and so that I can feed in the proper amount. And I put the bolt in the receiver. Just go through this again, just in case anyone wants to know. Put the bolt back in the receiver, close it down, and I can screw it onto the barrel. And then I use a feeler gauge to check the gap. And then I know just how far I have to advance before I make the final cut. And anyway, it's a relatively simple process. And I know I've shown it before, so I'm not going to bother showing it now. Instead, we're essentially done with this for all intents and purposes. So for right now, this is Will Henry, barely in the picture, and I'm out.